Father, you want to have me married, but can you find a girl that would be my match? Father, she must be able to get up before I do. She must be able to mount her horse before I can mount my black stallion. She must be able to reach the bloody land of the infidels before I do, and she must bring me back an enemy head, said the son. Janla Koja said, Son, you do not want a girl. You want a brave warrior so that you can eat and drink and have a good time at her expense. Janturale said, Yes, you're right. Now go and find me a pretty Turkman girl so I can fall upon her all of a sudden and destroy her virginity. What I just read out to you is the tale of Janturale from the book of TEDxYouth, filled with many mythical narratives and cultural values and morals substantial to the pre-Islamic beliefs of people in Turkic nations such as Azerbaijan, where I'm from, as well as Turkey, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and to a lesser degree, also Kyrgyzstan. But before you get so upset, here's a Western example. Sleeping Beauty, in which a seemingly delusional and deranged man decides to take it upon himself to crawl into the bed of an unconscious woman and kiss her, and then has it written off as saving her, or doing it for the good of their now merging kingdoms and nations. So for the sake of international diplomacy and peace, of course. But let me ask you this. If Prince Charming can do virtually whatever he wants to an unconscious woman for the sake of having her rule by him in the end, then why can't Janturale do more or less the same thing for the very same end result of having a woman rule by him? Because it's Western? Because it's Disney? Because it's part of our childhood? Isn't that inherently the problem, that something that so obviously contributes to the mass misinformation and miseducation of young children on issues such as consent and respect is part of our childhood? Ingrained into our minds since we were young, impressionable youth, desperately searching for role models wherever we could find them. And yes, that's including the princes and princesses detailed in these very stories. So, knowing this, it's important to examine, are the messages that we're conveying and the stereotypes that we're perpetuating through the stories that we read to young children actually worth it, or do they need to be retold, re-examined, or simply forgotten? According to Professor Andrea Breen, stories have the potential to alter our brains because across time and culture, they've proven themselves to be agents of personal transformation. So if stories are this powerful in impacting our brains, doesn't it just make logical sense that we should be more critical about the stories that we're sharing with children and what the messages ingrained into them and later into these children's brains actually are? Going back to the example of Janturale. Surely this can't be a story that we'd ever thought okay to share with young children, let alone praise as national folklore. And yet it is, because we as a society have made an unspoken agreement to prioritize historical and cultural significance over the messages that we should be and need to be conveying to these new younger generations in today's day and age. We're all at fault, because every time that we share stories like Sleeping Beauty or Snow White, we're both ignoring and enabling the issue. Because we then turn around and beg the question of, oh, how did rape culture weasel its way into and assimilate into our day-to-day lives and culture? Quite hypocritically, might I add. In the age of Me Too, we need to be going back to the Sleeping Beauty example even, and inquiring, what if Sleeping Beauty, what if Aurora, had never actually woken up? Are we really to assume that it would have stopped at just a kiss? It sounds a little more twisted when you put it like that, doesn't it? Now let's look at it this way. If a story in today's day and age were to contain any sort of sentence like, now go and find me a pretty girl so I can fall upon her all of a sudden and destroy her virginity, today, there'd be riots. Twitter would be having a ball, throwing around the hashtag canceled left and right. The authors, publicists, anyone and everyone complicit in the creation of such a book would be slammed and have their careers permanently stained. But just because it was written a long time ago, and things were different then, and it's just a product of that generation, we choose to accept it? No, actually, not just accept it, but continue to praise it and call it a staple of our childhoods that we need to share with each generation that comes after ours. Doesn't that sound so incredibly, terrifyingly warped? So that brings us to the question then of what is acceptable to share in stories. Well, that's always changing because our values and morals as a society are constantly changing to adapt to our advancement and levels of tolerance. But what we can try to answer is this: are these perhaps problematic stories worth perpetuating, or will they always require a debrief with your kids? Well, according to Professor Andrea Breen, again, of the University of Guelph, identity is constructed through stories. The stories that you tell about yourself change throughout your lives, depending on the stories that you're exposed to, your culture, your family background, your relationships, experiences, and so on. So this means that the stories that you're actually telling to your young children can have an impact on their identity in the long run. So that's why you need to be so careful of what you're actually exposing them to. Professor Breen goes on to say that these stories not only contribute to the understanding of the outside world on who we are as a human being, but also construct our own understanding of our identity and sense of self. So the next time you read your kid a bedtime story, know about the message that you're sending to them. Now, since this talk is being developed in Prague, I'd like to share with you a pomlaska. A pomlaska is part of an Easter Monday tradition that essentially delves into how Czech men and boys are encouraged to run around collecting willow branches, tying them together and decorating them, or simply purchasing them in our many Easter markets, and deciding to whip young Czech women and girls with them for the sake of luck and fertility, and to show that they like them. Though the issue isn't as prevalent today, it's still important to note that just years ago, you would have seen Czech men and boys running around whipping random girls to show that they liked them, or to make them more fertile or lucky. The Czech radio actually decided to conduct an interview on this in the past year, inviting Ms. Hausenblasová from the NGO Gender Studies. As Ms. Hausenblasová explained, the radios received countless calls from young women and young teenage girls talking about their experiences being whipped in the past year. But they all more or less came to the same conclusion. It's okay because it'll give us more luck in the coming year. So this shows, as Ms. Hausenblasová explains, that it's not simply men against women, but that women are actually complying with it. This shows just how impactful cultural narratives and storytelling can be in the historical normalization of behavior that otherwise simply wouldn't stand. This also brings us to the idea of rape culture and how children's beliefs can be very easily influenced by the stories that they're told. For example, why is it that adults share misinformed beliefs about consent? Why is it that victims don't know that they're victims of assault, abuse, or harassment and not just of a bad night? How is it that assailants and attackers don't understand the magnitude of their actions, or that their victims, not partners but victims, withdrew or never actually gave their consent to begin with? A good place to start to take accountability would be in the stories that we're telling them. These same now adults, since they were much more vulnerable, easily influenced at a younger age, when they were still children. Whether these stories were myths about the fertility of Czech girls when whipped, or Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Jan Turelle, or so on. So, at this point, you may be saying that these stories are actually being retold because they're no longer acceptable or tolerable in today's society. But it's important to me to differentiate and identify to say that maybe this is only really happening in the Western canon. As with most human rights endeavors into women's rights, LGBT rights, and so on, most change is only really being made within Western culture and in the Western world. And though Western culture and society is still very much important, we all know by now that change isn't truly being made until the change is being brought to the cultures, societies, nations, and communities that need this change the most. And while Western society and culture is still very much important, it would be a mistake to assume that the problem is being solved or nullified at all if it's only going to these very privileged, developed, and ultimately Western nations. But here's another facet to consider. Maybe we don't actually need to get rid of these cultural stories so much as we need to retell them and revise them in a way that reflects 21st century values and also keeps that story alive in your own culture, as culture is still very much a living thing. So to all the parents, guardians, caretakers, and siblings in the room, the next time that you read your child a bedtime story, be aware that stories have very important meaning, and they hold great levels of magnitude. They impact us in the long run. Be self-aware of the potentially detrimental stories in your own culture or that you're reading to your children, whether those be Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Can Turalı, just myths about the fertility of Czech girls when whipped, or simply an element of your childhood that doesn't sit quite right with who you perceive yourself and your identity to be today. Be self-aware and make these changes. Be aware of the information that you're passing on in day-to-day life or when you're reading your children bedtime stories, and make sure that it's leaving the world a positive impact. And if it's not, revise, retell, revisit. Thank you.